Yo, what's up guys? And before I get into this video, I just wanted to say a lot of my attempts for my first solo flawless run were streamed on Twitch along with our day one. So if you guys can go over in the description and give me a follow or just come by one of the streams, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Now, getting into this guide, first of all, I want to say that this dungeon is not easy, but it's definitely not harder than Ghost of the Deep. I would honestly put this dungeon on par as the difficulty of Spire or the Watcher solo flawless. So if you're able to get that solo flawless, there's a pretty good chance that you'll be able to get this one too. Especially with the loadouts and strategies that I'll be giving you guys today, it will make this dungeon way easier to solo flawless. There should be timestamps on this video, so you should be able to skip to any part if you need to. So yeah, let's get straight into it. Now, before we also get into the guide, I wanted to say this is not going to be a tutorial on how to do the dungeon, rather a guide for what you should be using per encounter to have the highest chance of success for this solo flawless. There will also be gameplay in the background of me doing this while I explain what I am doing. Alright, getting straight into it, let's just start out with our loadouts. Now, for most of this dungeon, you're going to be using the same loadout for pretty much every boss. The only time you're going to be switching stuff around is going to be for final, and that is only going to be swapping to a different set of weapons. Now, this entire build is built around being able to have infinite restoration ×2, so that way you're able to just run around, kill stuff, and keep up your restoration and not die. Now, my variant of this build is just going to be using sun bracers, but I've also seen other people using a variant using constant armlets with their newly buffed / reworked version of their exotic ability. But for simplicity and not having to armor swap for this entire build, we're just going to be sticking with sun bracers. Now, starting out with our subclass, we're going to be on Solar, using Well of Radiance, Phoenix Dive, and this is how we are going to be getting restoration ×2, so it is important you have Phoenix Dive, the Snap, and Solar Grenades. Along with that, our aspects are going to be Heat Rises and Touch of Flame. This is so that way we are able to eat your grenade, and when you Phoenix Dive, you get restoration ×2. And Touch of Flame will basically make it so our solar grenades are just insane. Now, our fragments are going to be Ash of Ember, so that way we are able to apply more Scorch stacks to targets, which is very important for our build. Ember of Resolve, this is just so we have a little bit more survivability when we're throwing our grenades on top of the restoration ×2. And Ember of Singeing, this is so that way we get our class ability back faster when we're scorching targets. And Ember of Empyrean, this allows us to use our solar weapon to extend the duration of our restoration and radiant. This is just so that way we're able to always make sure that we have our restoration ×2 no matter what. Now, like I said before, along with that, our exotic of choice is going to be sun bracers. Now, getting into the armor mods that I would recommend for this, first of all, on our helmet, I would recommend you run a Harmonic Siphon, Ashes to Assets, and Heavy Ammo Finder if you can fit all of that. If you cannot fit one of them, I would recommend probably taking off the Harmonic Siphon. Now, for our arms, I would recommend running 2 bolstering detonations and 1 firepower. If you have to take one of them off, I would take off 1 bolstering. On top of Ember and Singeing, this bolstering detonation will allow us to make sure we have the most uptime for our class ability. So that way, whenever we're in a pinch, we can Phoenix Dive and get a lot of health instantly, or so that way, if we lose our restoration ×2, we can get it back up as quick as possible. Now, for our chest piece, I recommend running 2 arc resist and 1 void. The reason I say this is because the arc resist is for mainly the eyes. The eyes will do a arc attack, which does a lot of damage if you're not careful. So this will kind of help mitigate that. And the void resist is so that way you don't take as much damage from the final 2 bosses, because they both do void. There's also some other minor void attacks throughout the dungeon, so this is also just a nice thing to have. For our legs, I would recommend running 2 solar weapon surges and 1 harmonic scavenger. This is so that way we don't have to be swapping our loadouts during the dungeon, and it would just be as easy as possible. Now, this might be hard depending on what kind of mods you have to put on for your stats, but if you can fit it, I would definitely try to. Now, for our bond, I run Outreach, Powerful Attraction, and Time Dilation. The Powerful Outreach is so that way we can use our class ability to pick up orbs from wherever we are. That way, if we can't run to them, or if the damage phase already starts, we can just do that. And the Time Dilation is just so that way we can get the most out of our armor charge stacks. Now, let's move on to our weapons. And honestly, for this dungeon, you only really need about 5 weapons, and one of them can be interchanged for something else. Now, starting out with our kinetic slot, the first thing I would recommend, and this is mainly for final boss, is the Supremacy with Rewind rounds and Kinetic Tremors. This is because you want to save as much ammo as possible for final boss for when you get to the top floor. So this is going to be the main weapon for DPS on final boss until you get to the top floor, and it honestly is kind of crazy with how much damage it does. Now, the second weapon in this slot that you're going to need is either the Nox Perennial Fusion Rifle, however you pronounce it, with Envious Assassin or Controlled Burst. If you can't get one of those, which is probably pretty likely just because it is a world drop, then I would get the brand new Seasonal Fusion Rifle with Slice and Controlled Burst. Now, the reason why I suggest the world drop one more is just because it has a really good roll and it'll do a ton of damage. And the Scattered Signal is not that bad either. It's just that it doesn't have as great of a roll for total DPS than to that world drop one. See, Slice applies Sever whenever you use your class ability, which is really good for part of our artifact mod. Controlled Burst is also amazing to pair with it, just because it increases your damage and reduces the charge time of the fusion rifle. Now, for your energy slot, I would recommend having Zalu's Bane with Explosive Payload Incandescent and the Sunshot Exotic Hand Cannon. Now, you will be using mostly Zalu's throughout the first two encounters, only swapping to Sunshot for the final encounter. Now, if we get to our heavy weapons of choice, we are going to be using Dragon's Breath for the first two bosses, which it is insane for damage if used properly, and Cataclysmic with Bait and Switch 4th times the charm. Cataclysmic is honestly just a staple of DPS strategies when you need to conserve ammo. Now, with all that being said, let's get into our artifact mods. Now, there are a lot of artifact mods this season that will definitely help a lot of players complete this solo flawless, along with any other solo flawless dungeon, to be honest. Starting out with the two most important, it is going to be Solo Operative, which gives you a 15% damage increase when you are the only member of your fire team, which you will be in this case. And Argent Ordnance, which basically makes it so whenever you shoot your rocket, you basically get increased damage until you reload or stow the weapon, which is going to be insane for Dragon Breath. The reason for this is because Argent Ordnance increases damage by 15%, and I'm assuming it's only the impact and explosion damage and not the ignitions. Now, the other most important mod is going to be Revitalizing Blast, which basically makes it so enemies get a weakened debuff on them whenever you use a solar ability on them, which is a 15% increase in damage. And considering the majority of our DPS strategy is around Sunbracers, it is going to be quite insane to have that extra 15% damage. Now, two more artifact mods that are going to be really helpful during this is going to be Unraveling Orbs, which picking up an Orb of Power grants strand weapons unraveling rounds, and Torch. While Radiant, deal increased weapon damage to combatants affected by strand and stasis debuffs. Now, the last mod that is going to be probably a must-have for this solo flawless is going to be From Whence You Came, which basically increases your damage to taken and scorned combatants, and I believe this is a 5% damage increase. Now, some artifact mods that I would suggest you have for this but are not necessary are going to be Wish into Being, which basically makes it so when your super is nearly fully charged, the ability Final Blows can spawn orbs of power. And another one I would suggest is Kindling Trigger. Radiant causes solar weapons to apply Scorch to unscorched combatants, which is just nice for ad clear. And Flint Striker, which basically makes it so rapid solar weapon precision hits will basically give you Radiant. So basically the entire gameplay loop of this build is you proccing your heat rises. Once you proc your heat rises, any kill you get in the air will extend the duration of your heat rises. Now, along with that, if we Phoenix Dive, it'll basically give you restoration times 2. Now, because of one of our fragments and aspect, if we are in the air, we get kills with our solar weapon, we will be extending the duration of our radiant heat rises and restoration times 2. Now, the thing with Restoration and Radiant, to extend them, you don't even have to be in the air. As long as you're getting kills with your solar weapon, you'll still be extending those. But you want to try to keep your Heat Rises and Radiant and Restoration all up at the same time. Now, before going into the first boss details on what you should be doing here, the weapons of choice you're going to be wanting to run is going to be either one of the Strand Fusion Rifles and Zalu's Bane and Dragon's Breath. Now, like I said earlier, I will not be going into how to be doing this encounter. I will just be giving you tips and tricks of how to make it easier to do this solo. Now, I don't see this first boss being an issue for most players doing solo flawless, especially if you've done many in the past. This is just not really that hard of a boss encounter. As most, even in my solo flawless run, it took me less than 5 minutes to complete. It honestly took longer to get through the cell and the jumping puzzle to second encounter than it did to take out this first boss. Now, the only thing I can really say here is that you just want to make sure you can keep your restoration up as long as possible. It honestly isn't even all that needed considering the ad destiny is pretty low anyways, but it's more of just a safety net to make sure that you don't die. Now, my strategy for this is to make sure that I can get up to restoration times 2 at least to 10 seconds before getting teleported, so that way when you get teleported you can kill the eyes and keep your restoration up at high as possible, as the eyes do count as kills for your restoration. Now, one tip I do have for the eyes in the cage if you're struggling with it is that you can use your radar to not pinpoint where the eyes are per se, but as to more pinpoint where they are not. As you can see on the map, they will still count as a red square, so you know what direction they are, or aren't in this case. But I definitely would not solely rely on the radar carrying on finding out where the eyes are. I would still recommend just looking around for them as much as you can. Now, when it comes to the totems that the boss lets out, you want to make sure that you get both of them to ensure that you get the maximum type for damage. If you don't get both, it's fine. You want to prioritize playing your life over getting both totems and dying. But if you do get both and you're doing good damage, you should be able to 3-phase this boss. It should only take 3, but if you get unlucky with totems, for example, or you just have a bad damage phase, it could take 4 to 5. Now, for when it actually comes to damage, my entire goal of this is to leave up as many adds as possible, so that way I am able to proc my sunbracers during damage phase. Now, when I am capturing the totems, when I get to the second totem, I usually place my well to ensure I do not die. Now, my entire damage strategy is to use Sunbracers to damage the boss along with Dragon's Breath to ignite a ton of times. So when you're on that last totem and you see your wish is at 5 seconds left or so, you want to melee one of the adds near you, and if you don't have your melee, you can jump up in the air, and because of heat rises and where you're getting kills in the air, you'll get your melee back. But when you have 5 seconds left on your wish, you want to get a melee kill to proc Sunbracers and throw it on the boss. If you're able to get a second Sunbracers proc in that damage phase, that would be for the best. But if you can't, it's fine. Just focus on doing damage with Dragon's Breath and your fusion rifle. Now, after you stack all your grenades before damage phase starts, and when it starts, you want to swap over to your fusion rifle and use Phoenix Dive. This is so that way if you're using the Slice on the Scattered Signal fusion rifle, you're able to proc your Sever. And if you're using Nox, you're able to pick up an orb that is around you to proc the Unraveling rounds thanks to the artifact mod, Unraveling Orbs. And as long as you're still Radiant and have torches as one of the unlocks in your artifact, you'll be able to use the strand debuffs to deal increased damage with your weapons because of Radiant. Now, once you do your damage phase, it's pretty much just going to be a repeat the entire time. I would definitely recommend taking advantage of Ashes the Assets to get your well back before the next damage phase if possible. You will be cutting it a little bit close though. But honestly, this is a pretty easy boss fight. It's basically just rinse and repeat. Now, moving on to second boss. Now, this is where I see a lot of people are probably going to be having issues with this and final, but if you're using the build correctly, this honestly shouldn't be too bad of a boss fight. Now, the biggest annoying part about this encounter is probably being knocked out of your damage plates and losing out on damage, so you'll have to do maybe an extra phase or two. Hopefully not two. Now, the loadout for this is going to be the exact same as first boss, so you just want to stick with your fusion rifle, Zalu's Bane hand cannon, and Dragon's Breath. Along with that, the strategy is basically the exact same as first boss, where you're going to be wanting to proc your Sunbracers during damage phase in order to get the most damage on boss with your Dragon's Breath. Before we get to actual damage strategies, let's talk about getting to damage. Now, getting to damage can be a little bit annoying just because of how long it takes, but the strategy of just having infinite restoration by heat rising and phoenix diving and getting continuous kills is pretty much just going to carry this. Now, one thing about this boss though is because it's an ogre, it has the ability to push you back with its eye blast, which can be very annoying. And I've had it happen to me multiple times while trying to get this solo flawless done. But with heat rises, as long as you have a good timer on it, you should be able to float back to the arena. But the way you spawn the two guys that spawn the torches are going to be by shooting out all the eyes in the middle. What I like to do is shoot them all out and then leave one on either side. I typically like leaving one on the left side because that's the guy I like to use to get the totems. Now, each phase of spawning these guys in, you want to try to get 2 totems. The way you do this is by shooting him a little bit until he spawns one of the totems. Once he spawns the totem, you're able to kill him, then he'll drop the second one on his dead body. Now, I would make sure that your frostbite is as low as possible before going to capture them, because once you start getting up to the 7 or 8 frostbite territory, it's going to get very risky. So my thing before going to capture the totems is making sure that I'm standing next to one of the torches to make sure I have no frostbite and then go over to capture them. Now, I do recommend going to the left side over the right side just because going over to the right side is a little bit safer, but his totem spawns sometimes bug out and just don't spawn. I usually find the left side to be a little bit more consistent with getting him to spawn in both totems. Now once you get all 4 totems and spawn in all 4 of the fire orbs that you can pick up and deposit, you want to deposit 3 of them, the 2 closest to you and 1 on either left or right. Once you do this, you want to wait for the Taken to spawn in again and make sure that you have max restoration and radiant for damage phase. Reason for this is because throughout the entire damage phase, you want to have the max radiant and max restoration to make sure that you do not die while doing damage. Now, once you see the Taken spawning in on the far sides, you want to take that last orb and deposit it. And as long as you have max radiant and restoration before heading over there, you should be fine on your timer. Now, once you get over there and deposit the orb, you want to snap and jump at the same time to make sure that you refresh your radiant and restoration timers. Along with this, it'll proc your sun bracers. Now that your sun bracers are procced, you should be throwing them at boss along with shooting your dragon breath. Now, as long as you're kind of jumping and killing ads around you at the same time, you should be able to get your snapback for the next fire. And basically from here, it's just you want to get your snapback for each fire so that way you're able to reproc sun bracers. Now, remember, if you don't get your snapback before going to the next fire, it is fine. As long as you don't stand in the next fire, it won't start the next damage phase. And as long as the ogre doesn't get to the fire before you, you'll keep your damage phase going. The reason I say this is because this allows you to basically either kill the Scorn or snap at the Scorn if you don't have any more Taken that are on the sidelines to get your Sunbracers procced or to get them back. Now, this isn't completely necessary per se. You want to play your life more than you want to get damage out. So if this isn't a viable strategy that you're comfortable with, then I would just play it safe. Don't risk your life. But when you get to the last few lamps or the fires, you want to make sure on the very last one, place your well and just pump out as much damage as you can. And as long as you're doing like decent damage, you should be able to get this boss down in 3 phases, maybe 4. So basically, to recap this entire section, you want to try to keep your restoration times 2 up as long as you can. Along with that, you want to try to keep it up throughout the entire damage phase, so that way you don't die to ads and you're able to save your well for the last little DPS plate. Also, while during DPS, you also want to try to make sure to use Sunbracers for every single plate, so that way you can get the most damage possible from them, along with not having to waste as much fusion rifle shots for the final plate. You also want to make sure to use your Dragon's Breath rocket at least once per plate. If you can spare the ammo, use it twice per plate, but yeah, you just want to make sure to be using that as much as possible. With all that, you should be able to clear the second boss with a rinse and repeat, and it shouldn't be too hard. It might take a little while just because of how long it takes to actually get 2 damage phases, but yeah, other than that, it shouldn't be too bad. Now, final boss. Final boss is honestly annoying just because of one mechanic. The Hex. The Hex can definitely screw you over if you don't transfer it in time, or if the guy transfers it back to you at the last second. But before getting into that, let's talk loadout. For the loadout, you're going to want to be using the Supremacy Sniper with Rewind and Kinetic Tremors, so that way you can conserve your heavy ammo. The way we are using this sniper is when you're not on the very top floor where you have the 3 plates in a row, you want to be using your Supremacy Sniper. This sniper with Rewind Connect Tremors allows you to just shoot this thing constantly, and you should easily get to the damage health gate. Secondly, we are going to be using the Sunshot. This is going to be so we have easy ad clear with our Sunshot, along with us able to keep our Radiant and Restoration up as long as possible very easily. Finally, we have Cataclysmic. Cataclysmic is kind of a staple for just how good of an ammo efficient gun it is, and we are going to be taking full advantage of that. So the way we are using this is we are only using it on the last 3 platforms on a damage phase. So the way I use this is when you got to the top 3 floors where they were just 3 platforms in a row you would do damage at, and that's when I would use Cataclysmic for damage instead of the sniper rifle. This basically ensures that you can get the most amount of damage possible without making sure that you're out of heavy ammo for that top floor. So with that being said, and the weapons and how to use them, the basically entire goal of this encounter is going to be doing what you did for the last 2 encounters. You're just going to want to make sure you have your heat rises, restoration up as much as possible. Now, with the mechanics of this boss fight, it is kind of tough, just because mainly the Hex is one thing that you have to really micromanage. Along with that, you want to make sure that you kill both of the big guys that spawn totems, so that way you can get as long as possible during damage phase. Now, you can get 3, but having 2 is more than enough to meet that health gate. With that being said, you're basically doing the same thing on every floor. You're just clearing out all the ads, trying to keep your restoration up, and you're going to be eventually spawning in the 2 big guys by shooting the eyes next to the boss. Once you do that, it'll spawn the 2 big guys and the Hex will spawn in a few seconds later. What I do is I proc Sunbracers to kill both of the big guys at the same time, stand in one of them. Once that first one is cleansed, I run over to the second one and wait for the Hex guy to get over there with me. Once he is over there with me, I keep an eye on the timer, so it's at the last, 3 seconds or so. Once that happens, I melee him to transfer it over. If I haven't completely captured the totem yet, then I'll run away and make sure the guy dies before I go back over to capture it fully. This is just to ensure you don't die to the Hex by him reapplying it to you by getting hit by him. Once you capture both totems, I usually go into the middle right in front of the boss, and whenever my wish is in the last couple seconds, I'll place my well and get ready for damage. Now, like I said before, we're only using the sniper for damage, so that way we can conserve all of our heavy ammo for the very top floor. You should get enough bricks for each time to use your sniper, but if you don't, you can use a little bit of your cataclysmic, but I wouldn't use all of it, just enough to get to the health gate. If you are able to, I would also use Sunbracers on the boss if you're out of special ammo. Now, once you fight your way up those 3 platforms and get to the rapid fire section where you have 3 platforms you jump to, you want to basically sit behind the middle pillar and only peek out when you're able to shoot with your cataclysmic. I wouldn't stand out in the open just because you will not have a well for one, and those eyes will absolutely beam you if you stand out for too long. So if you're able to, just sit behind the middle pillar on each of the 3 platforms and you should be safe. If you feel like you're about to die, play it safe, use your Phoenix dive, just don't overcommit if you think you're about to die. Once you basically get rid of that rapid fire round, you basically will just get teleported back down to the bottom floor and restart. Once you do this enough, you'll eventually get him to the very final health gate, which will basically signify final stand. Now, final stand can be very rough if you don't have ammo, but what we found out that you could do is you can basically use Sunbracers on the eyes to basically just keep throwing your grenades at him by proccing it off the eyes, which actually worked out very well in one of our runs. So this is a very viable strat if you do not have ammo. It also allows you to get your well back pretty quickly too, so if you don't have well, you'll be able to get it off that pretty easily. But you want to make sure you're standing behind those pillars so that way you don't get absolutely beamed by the eyes. Now, after doing this enough times, you should be able to kill the final boss, and that should be your solo falls completed. Just want to say thank you guys for watching this video. If you guys found it helpful, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. And if you guys greatly could leave me some feedback in the comment section below on what I can improve on while making this guide, that would be amazing. I'm looking forward to making more stuff like this in the future if you guys would like. Along with that, I hope you guys have an amazing day and thank you for watching.